All right, so this is a manuscript that I was working on back in the years between about 2005 and 2008, something like that, called The Wonder Child versus the Elders. Now, I found this a few weeks ago as I was going through a trunk of old manuscripts, along with the novel that I've been reworking. The novel needs a lot of work. This really doesn't. It's pretty much complete. It just needs some mild editing. I did leave it incomplete at the time. It was lacking a couple of chapters near the end. But it's mostly complete, so I'm going to publish it here on Substack, chapter by chapter, and this is for paid customers only. It's $5 a month to subscribe to my Substack if you want to read this, and also the novel, The Wonder Child versus the Elders. So it's a history of the dead, and what it does is it goes back and it looks here. I'll read the first few paragraphs for you, and just sort of lay it out. This is a work of art of mine, a painting that I did back around that time. It's kind of a totemic ancestor being. Okay, so introduction. This is the introduction to the book. This book begins with two questions and then attempts through the unfolding of its pages to answer them. Firstly, why is it that the elderly, commonly called senior citizens, are treated in the West with such scant regard, whereas in Asia and in traditional societies, generally speaking, they are not elderly, but known as the elders and are held in high esteem? And to this question, we add a second, namely, why is it that of all the world's high civilizations, the West has the shortest Day of the Dead of them all, i.e. Halloween, which is not only a single day of the calendar year, but in practical reality occupies only a couple of hours and is not even a paid holiday. The Mesopotamians had a Day of the Dead every month known as the Kishpu feast, held at the dark of every new moon, in which places were set at the table for those who had long since departed. The Egyptians likewise had the beautiful Feast of the Valley, which lasted for several days in the middle of the month of April, and even the Greeks, the first culture, as we will later see, to turn away from the elders and toward the cult of the Wonder Child, recognized their dead with at least two festivals held at different times of the year. The Anthesteria, celebrated on the 11th through the 13th of the month Anthesterion in the springtime, and the Genesia, which was celebrated at Athens on the 5th of Boedromion in our September-October. Both questions imply a correlation between the degree to which a society esteems its dead and the reverence or lack thereof given to its aged citizens. The two attitudes go invariably hand in hand, for both the dead and the aged members of a population represent the evanescent horizon of the past, with its perpetual vanishing away, whereas the youth and the child generally point toward the future. A dead body, that is something that has become. It no longer flows through time and has become merely matter occupying space. It is in space, but out of time. An aged member of the population likewise points to the past, since such an individual has less of his future before him than he does his past. An old person is mostly past, and tends to have a mentality that conserves and guards that past. Just like old Nestor in the Iliad, who is forever reminiscing about his battles in the good old days when men were tougher and braver than the heroes presently besieging the citadel of Troy. The young, on the other hand, especially in the West, are forever rushing off toward new horizons and new possibilities and tend to be more open to new ideas. How much of this is a cultural construct and how much of it is biologically grounded? This book, while recognizing the latter possibility, tends to incline more toward the former, for I will spend most of its chapters arguing that age versus youth is a relative thing and differs in its valuation and possibilities from culture to culture. Let's see, and then it goes on for a while. It's about 5,000 words here, the introduction, and it gives a sort of outline down here in the middle of what the main sort of punctuation points of the book are, with these creative singularities, and mortuary ruptures. We'll discuss the Paleolithic singularity, 35,000 BC. It is in just this period that we find scarcely any burials of the Cro-Magnon dead in Western Europe, at just the time when new technologies are proliferating. And so the thesis of the book is that cultural singularities take place when there is a weakening of interest in the cult of the dead. It's either fading away or it loses its mesmeric hold on the population and thus creates a space for a sudden release, a sudden series of technological transformations. In astrological terms, you might say Saturn gives up its conservative hold to the past and the dead, and Uranus comes in and brings in lots of technological innovations. So during this Paleolithic singularity, all these burials we don't find them. They're just not there, but yet there's this massive technological profusion with modern Homo sapiens coming in, and the Neanderthals can't compete, and so they are out. It says here, Neanderthal burials are present during this time, but it is precisely the Neanderthals who are the conservators, fading off into the past with their inability to keep up with the new culture of the incoming peoples. Then we discussed the pottery Neolithic singularity, 6500 to 5500 BC. It's at just this time that the skull cult, which had lasted all through the pre-pottery Neolithic, is beginning to fade away, and the first cemeteries as separate locales for the dead, as at Yarm Tepe, are beginning to come in. That we also have a new explosion of technologies occurring in tandem with a fundamental change in mortuary practices, namely the rise of cremation of the dead and the working of metals, the advent of pottery, and the series of what the cultural historian Mary Sedegast has termed pyrotechnologies in her marvelous book, Plato Prehistorian. Then we have the Archean singularity, 3500 BC, at just the time of the rise of the first cities in ancient Sumer, with a vast profusion of new technologies such as temple building, concrete, the first locks, the first brewing of beer and wine, the first castles, the creation of the city-state, a developed mathematics and astronomy, writing, cylinder seals, a new monumental art of stone-carved figures, the invention of the first columns, beekeeping, etc., etc. It is just this time that we fail to find much in the way of burial practices anywhere in Sumer. This development was prefaced at Tel Es-Sawan, an early Sumerian site where irrigation might have been invented off the Tigris River, a site which began as a necropolis and then developed over time into an early fortress town in which the dead were then relocated to a separate cemetery altogether, cemetery altogether at the site of Samarra, located several miles away. In other words, at this 6000 BC Mesopotamian site, the dead are already being moved out of the way, and a clearing is created for the advent of a pantheon of deities who come in now to replace the revered dead of the cult of the ancestors as the primary divinities, each one of whom is the patron of a specific technology: Enki of irrigation and water projects, Enlil, the inventor of the hoe, Ninurta, inventor of irrigation and the plow, Nanisine of boats, Inanna of astronomy, Kalab, the god of brickmaking, Enkimdu of canals, Geshtanana of winemaking, Dumuzi of sheep herding, etc., etc. Then we have the Harappan singularity that takes place in India, 2600 BC. Here we find that the first cities in India are coming into being practically simultaneously at Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Ganwirwala, Rakagarhi, Lothal, etc. A whole series of technical innovations appears almost all at once, including water technologies for sewers and drains, baked brick architecture, writing, the laying out of cities on rectilinear grids, the drilling of hard stone beads, the making of stamp seals, etc., etc. This occurs at roughly the same time as separate cemeteries for the dead are being created outside the city limits, located usually to the east, as at Kalibanga. Then we have the spring and autumn rupture in China, 600 BC. This is a period of technological explosion that occurs in tandem with a weakening of the cult of the ancestors and a new attitude of disdain on the part of the nobles for the old ways of the elders. The Analects of Confucius is a deliberate and emphatic response to this new weakening of respect. The cult of the revered dead associated with the Zhou ruler gives way to the rise of heavenly cults of deities and cosmic spirits that are worshipped out in the open at altars that are located in natural settings. Halls of the ancestors are, at this time, not as important as new altars dedicated to cosmic gods, and it is precisely in the 6th century that new technologies appear in China for the first time: irrigation, the plow, the first bronze agricultural tools, and the first cast iron and steel tools, the making of metal coinage, etc. Finally, we have then the Greek Dark Age singularity, 1200 to 900 BC. Perhaps surprisingly for some, this is actually a major period of technological innovation and change, and also the advent of changes in mortuary customs. In the 12th century, the Athenians built a new cemetery outside their city, the Keramikos Cemetery, whereas up to this point they had been burying their dead within the city limits. In the following century, the Athenians are the first Greeks to adopt the new mortuary practice of cremating the dead. And I don't mention this here later in the book, but cremation of the dead, as Nietzsche's friend Erwin Roda wrote in his book Psyche, is about cutting the ties with the underworld. There's no longer... The Mycenaeans were still burying their dead in tholos tombs, putting their bodies inside where you could go in and continually revisit them and make offerings. That's all done away with by the Dorians when they come in and they bring in cremation to cut the ties with the underworld. In the following century, the Athenians are the first Greeks to adopt cremating the dead. And at the same time, they create the proto-geometric pottery style, which is composed of large urns and amphorae used as grave markers in the cemetery and for storing the ashes of the dead inside them. This is also a period of the adoption of new technologies such as ironworking, The first iron sword in Greece appears at this cemetery. And there are changes made in fibulae, the pins used to hold clothing together, which undergo a radical new transformation at this time. The first temples, made out of wood and mud brick, dedicated as houses for the gods, start to appear at about this time at Nicoria, Smyrna, Lefkandi, all 10th century developments. And so that's the basic outline of the book. And then I have here a fun little rant against critical theory, which, of course, is based on a complete rejection of these kinds of grand meta-narratives. But I side with Peter Sloterdijk there, that the death of the grand meta-narrative has been announced too soon, I think. I think there are still ways of organizing the past in interesting patterns that cannot just be dismissed as essentialist, as Edward Said would have done, or as Foucault would have done, is dismiss it as a power-knowledge dichotomy. That's just not what this book is about, but it's precisely why I couldn't find a publisher for it. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to find a publisher because the winds had changed. It wasn't like Viking Press back in the 1960s publishing Joseph Campbell's Masks of God and Lewis Mumford and so forth. Those days ended in the publishing world in the 90s. The publishing world is just as corrupt and degenerate an institution as the university system. And I have, in Quigley's terms, I have circumvented both of those petrified institutions and gone my own way. To quote Deleuze, I've traced my own line of flight on the nomadic. I'm an individual nomad out on the plain, circling around this dying civilization with my projects. Anyhow, it's $5 a month if you want to read this thing. I'm going to be putting up chapter by chapter, probably every few days, something like that. And I still also do astrology readings. For those of you who are interested, hit me up at johndavidebert@gmail.com. We are at my school, beginning a course tomorrow, actually, on the history of Indian philosophy. So hit me up there at the same address if you're interested in that. We'll be doing that for the next 8 Saturdays. All right, I'll see you on Substack.